to you. And that is this here. Okay, so that's the topic of my talk, welfare ethics of argumentation. And so despite some 10 years beginnings and by now a growing number of essays on the topics, there is yet no systematically developed ethics of argumentation as an applied ethic, at least not published in its own right, but we are waiting for Katarina Stevens' book, which will come out soon. What we have so far, apart from not being a complete theory, has two big limitations. In this talk, I want to sketch how to go over these limitations. First, some virtue theory of argumentation has been developed, but this focuses on prudential virtues, especially epistemic virtues, whose functional aim is epistemic improvement. It does not focus on moral virtues, which are essentially about moral improvement, thereby resolving interpersonal conflicts of interest, in particular epistemic interest, but also quite different, for instance, commercial interests or interests of social recognition. Your interest in persuading me to believe in proposition P can conflict with my interest in knowing the truth about P. Or your interest in argumentative enlightenment by me can conflict with my interest in devoting myself to completely different things. Second, the few beginnings of an ethics of argumentation are mostly committed to a virtue ethics approach, which I think is quite problematic. To go against these limitations, this talk aims to develop the beginnings of a systematic ethics of argumentation, and a particular ethical approach will be welfarist. Hence, I will sketch a welfare ethics of argumentation. Why not a virtue ethics of argumentation, but a welfare ethics? In general normative ethics, virtue ethics, as compared to deontological or welfarist ethics, has relatively small number of followers because of some well-known problems of virtue ethics. Problem one, for virtue ethics, moral virtues are conceptually, epistemically, and also ontically primary in relation to potential moral values or moral commandments. Therefore, they cannot properly clarify and justify the content of morally preferred action with the instruments available in this approach. They presuppose that we know what a morally virtuous arguer is. This is something what argumentation theorists like Godou and Gordon have objected to prudential virtue argumentation theory as well, since the structural problem is the same. Instead, they rely on intuitions. First, a special sensitivity of the virtuous subject without providing her or those not yet so virtuous with a systematic criterion that goes beyond examples as to what exactly virtue consists of. And they presuppose that the not-so-virtuous subjects recognize who is virtuous and when the virtuous arguer behaves virtuously and, in rather rare cases, when not, without having any criteria at his disposal. Welfare ethics, on the other hand, have clear criteria in this respect. Problem two. And this leads immediately to the second, the methodological problem of virtue ethics. They are not based on any justification, but rely on mere intuitions. Problem three. Moral virtues are, functionally speaking, instruments for realizing morally better world. Other possible instruments for morally improving the world include norms and commandments, institutions, organizations, and states, and so on. Virtue ethics thus concentrate on one instrument for realizing a morally better world and dispense with all others. Problem four. The instrument dealt with, that is, moral virtues, is also motivationally weak. For the actual decision between argumentation in my own interest and argumentation that tries to accommodate the interests of many people, it relies solely on goodwill, which, however, as a rule, only a few people muster frequently enough and with sufficient strength. Deontological ethics are somewhat better off than virtue ethics with respect to all the problems mentioned. however, not to a satisfactory degree. But I leave it at that, since argumentation ethicists, among argumentation ethicists, there are not so many deontologists. And my aim in this talk is systematic, not critical, where the exposition of the systematic features will fill the remaining time. So the structure of my talk is: first, the general structure of the kind of welfare ethics I will rely on has to be exposed. Second, because this ethics presupposes a concept of utility, I will next explain the utility of argumentation according to the epistemological theory of argumentation. The rest of the paper applies the central ideas of welfare ethical approach to argumentation, developing how various moral instruments considered by that approach can morally improve argumentation. So, second part, components of a well, that has to be bigger. So, components of a welfare ethic and a new conception, instrument welfarism. This section presents welfare ethics in general for people who are not familiar with ethical theories. Above that, it specifies and briefly justifies a specific variant of welfare ethics. All fully developed welfare ethics consist of three main parts, which build on each other in the following logical order. First, there is a prudential utility theory, a theory of individual prudential utility. That is a theory which develops criteria for what is how good for a particular subject. Second, there is the moral value theory, a theory of moral desirability or moral value. That is a theory that defines criteria for what is morally good and how much. And the third part is a moral deontology or praxeology, a theory that develops criteria for how to act morally or which moral instruments should best be created to realize moral values, that is, to improve the world morally. So let me say something about the prudential utility theory. How good is a certain event P for a certain subject S? I don't dwell on this point. The most competing theories are extensionally sufficiently near to each other so that their differences are of no importance here. Second part, moral value theory. Welfare ethics define the moral value of an object, event, or state P as the so-called aggregation of the various prudential utilities of P for all individuals. That is, the moral value of P is calculated according to a mathematical formula from the various utilities U1, U2, and so on, for the various subjects, subject S1, S2, and so on. In the simplest case, namely in utilitarianism, the moral value of P is identical with the sum of all these utilities. In other welfare ethics, like prioritarianism, utility egalitarianism, sufficientarianism, the aggregation formula is somewhat more complicated. However, the differences between these various welfare ethics are not particularly relevant for the further considerations, because the moral judgments of the cases to be considered here do not diverge very much between the various welfare ethics. So let me come now to the third part, the moral deontology or praxeology. First, the standard theories. The morally decisive question is only answered in the third part of welfare ethics, the deontics or praxeology. Which actions should be carried out on the basis of the possible moral evaluations? Or more generally, what measures should now be taken? Very often, these questions are questions about moral obligations. What is our moral duty? Above all, within utilitarianism, various answers have been developed to this question, but they can also be combined with all other welfare ethics. I will therefore present them in the more general version, that is, as welfarism. instead of utilitarianism, prioritarianism, and so on. The simplest and by far the most widely held conception of moral duty among utilitarians is act welfarism. Always do what is welfaristically best, so always perform the action with the highest moral value. There's a huge number of objections to act welfarism. It is over-demanding, violates human rights, dissolves useful social institutions, doesn't intersubjectively coordinate, and so on. A further critique that is mostly neglected is that an act welfaristic obligation has no binding force. It is not really an obligation. My own conception of moral obligations, that is progressive real norm welfarism, starts from this point and relies on social norms as motivationally binding element. Moral deontology, a better conception of moral duties, and that is progressive norm welfarism. Socially valid norms are modes of behavior that are largely generally followed in the community in question and whose known non-compliance is usually sanctioned. A social norm is formally valid, namely legally, if its observance is monitored by specially authorized agent, and its non-compliance is punished by authorized agents with formal sanctions, from a verbal reprimand to capital punishment. A social norm is informally valid if the monitoring and sanctioning is undertaken by any person and the sanctions are informal, from frown to lynch law. According to this conception, that is norm welfarism, it is a moral duty to do action A if doing A is prescribed by a morally good and socially valid norm. However, this conception requires a new category of morally good actions, namely acts of norm support, that people monitor compliance with a norm and punish non-compliance, but also inform about the norm and promote it. In the case of formal norms, the specially appointed agents largely take on these tasks. However, they also require the support of the rest of the population, and informal norms are completely dependent on the voluntary commitment of appropriately motivated individuals. The support of informal norms cannot be a moral duty in the defined sense. It is at best an imperfect duty, or rather an action motivated mainly by one's own moral principles and ideals. Socially valid norms are not fixed, but change historically. Mainly improve. This is not an automatic process, though, but we should promote it. I call this part of the theory of moral norms progressivism. At this point, the conception of moral duties once again requires a new category of moral actions, namely the moral political commitment to work for a moral improvement of the existing stock of socially valid norms. By its very nature, moral commitment cannot be a moral duty in the defined sense, but again, only a commitment based on one's own moral principles and ideals. The objective for moral political commitment is the realistic optimization of norms, that is, to work towards the best of the short to medium-term socially enforceable reforms of the social norms. A third subpart on that third part of moral praxeology. Moral praxeology, a more fundamental conception of welfare ethics. Third part. Instrument welfarism. Functionally understood, moral norms are instruments for the realization of moral values. However, Moral norms are not the only such instruments. It is a major problem of welfarism in general not to have seen this and not to broaden the view from moral norms and duties to other instruments for realizing moral values. What other effective instruments can be used efficiently for improving the world morally? Some such other instruments are simple morally good actions, for instance, supererogatory action that is going beyond moral duty, appeals to others, instruction and information, social rules, virtues, institutions, organizations, states and their organs, confederations of states, and so on. The moral political commitment outlined above can then also be understood more broadly, namely that if it is efficient, it should also be concerned with the realization of such additional moral instruments. I call this particular conception of the broadly understood third part of welfare ethics instrument welfarism, in analogy with act welfarism, rule welfarism, and so on. The task of this part is to develop various good instruments for improving the world morally, among others, conceptions of moral norms and duties, but also many others. So I come to part 3, the utility of arguments according to the epistemological approach. The most general goal of welfare ethic is to bring about prudentially good consequences for the persons involved by one's actions. The actions that argumentation ethics is concerned with are argumentations in a double sense. First, acts of presenting an argument, and second, participations in argumentative discussions. In order to make the ethical relevance of individual moral actions and instruments comprehensible, the potential utility of argumentative actions and contributions in an argumentative discussion must therefore very shortly be clarified in an argumentation theoretical intermezzo. For this purpose, I draw on epistemological argumentation theory. This is because it develops criteria for good arguments, good argumentation, and for good argumentative discussions, which are very useful instruments for arguers and addressees or discussants, more useful than those conceived by other approaches to argumentation theory, and which also promote specific moral values, such as respect for others. According to epistemological argumentation theory, the function of arguments is to lead to cognition, that is, acceptable, rationally justified belief, and epistemologically conceived arguments do so by guiding people to check themselves whether the criteria for the acceptability of the thesis are fulfilled. This approach has various advantages. First, it leads to more true beliefs. Second, these beliefs, because of the justification connected to them, can be revised to the better in case of conflicting beliefs. Third, addressees acquire the belief by convincing themselves of the acceptability of the thesis. This in turn gives them autonomy and respects it. Arguments can be integrated into argumentative discussions. Epistemological argumentation theory has developed rules for fully cooperative discourses, disputations, which serve the purpose of examining and possibly revising a thesis or a bundle of related, possibly contradictory theses. The ideal end strived at in a disputation is that all discussants, after thorough, critical, and epistemologically informed examination, jointly accept a sufficiently detailed, argumentatively valid, and adequate argument, that is, thesis plus justification. This qualitative consensus, in turn, raises the degree of rational confidence in the thesis. So I come to the fourth part, moral norms for argumentations and argumentative discussions. In my sketch of welfare ethics, I have listed various welfare ethical instruments for the realization of moral values that are relevant for argumentation ethics, from general moral norms to moral virtues. In the remainder of my talk, I address the application of these tools to argumentation one by one, starting with moral norms. The first task will be to identify moral argumentation norms, that is, morally good, socially valid norms that are applicable to argumentation. They constitute our moral obligations. Morally relevant argumentations are, beginning with the most global characterization, interactions, then acts of communication, usually acts of assertion, often contributions to conversations, and then also acts of argumentation. As special cases of these nested, more general types of actions, they are then also subject to the moral norms for the more general types of actions. So, interaction norms. All forms of social interaction are subject to moral norms of civilized, well-mannered interaction, that is, to civility. Positively, civility demands respect for others, tolerance, considerateness, politeness, good manners. Negatively, civility prohibits in particular verbal or physical attacks on others, bullying, rudeness, discrimination. Physical attacks and, in some cases, verbal attacks are also prohibited by law. However, most of the mentioned norms only apply informally. Because these norms are morally good, according to norm welfarism, they also constitute moral commandments, in particular for argumentation. Communication norms. Relevant norms of communicative civility that go beyond the norms of interaction include willingness to listen carefully to others, up to a point, willingness and open-mindedness to having our opinions and biases challenged, willingness to admit one's own biases. Unethical breaches of norms, conversely, include cyberbullying, rudeness, religious intolerance, discrimination, name-calling. For the most part, these norms also only apply informally. They are morally good and therefore also moral norms, in particular for argumentation. All socially valid norms mentioned in the following are morally good and therefore also moral norms. Norms of assertion. Argumentations consist of assertions to which, as such, certain moral duties apply. The most important and best known social norm concerning assertions is the prohibition of lying. The prohibition of lying also applies legally in various contexts, for witnesses, experts, salespersons, and so on, but is generally only an informal norm in everyday contexts. However, its present-day content differs from the classic understanding of the prohibition of lying in two respects. Although the prohibition of lying is a perfect duty, it is only a pro tanto duty, which can therefore be trumped by more important duties or by the consideration of consequences that are particularly important in a specific case. Second, the prohibition of lying covers not only explicit, deliberately false statements, but also other forms of being misleading. That is the extended prohibition of lying. This also includes, for instance, anyone who presents only few selected facts as the whole truth, or tentative results as certain, or partial understanding as authoritative, is misleading the other. Fabricating evidence, inventing sources, deliberately misquoting are also a form of extended lying, as is exaggerating the epistemic status of one's claim. Is there an obligation of subjective justification? A standard assumption about assertions is that one may only assert that P if one has reasons for P, that is, if P is subjectively justified. If one considers that a subjective justification can also be very poor, a duty to justify actually only makes sense if reasonably good, epistemically qualified justification is meant. However, such an extended, already socially valid obligation to have reasons is more limited than it might initially appear. It certainly applies to surveyors, reviewers, experts, and so on, or to particular kinds of claims, for instance, claims with particular practical relevance for the listener, for instance, because important decisions depend on them, or in the case of potentially reputation-damaging claims. In most other cases, however, the extended obligation to have reasons so far is very weak or non-existent, measured against the criterion for moral duty explained before. For speakers who tend to be epistemically strong, having a good subjective justification for one's assertion is more a question of avoiding damage to their epistemic reputation than of moral blame. Duty of demonstrative justification. In addition to the strong subjective epistemic duty of justification, there is also the duty to justify the assertion to others by argumentation or direct evidence, if this is possible and when asked to do so. A corresponding informal, sometimes even formal legal norm applies in the subjective duty if the subjective duty to substantiate also applies. That is, for surveyors, reviewers, experts, and so on, in the case of claims with particular practical relevance or potentially reputation-damaging claims. If the speaker does not fulfill the obligation to give reasons, she, therefore, exposes the listener to an unnecessarily high risk, which the listener or others will punish, for instance, by reprimanding the asserting person accordingly. Outside of the situations just mentioned, providing a good demonstrative justification contributes to increasing one's own epistemic reputation, but is not a moral obligation. Next group, argumentation norms. Prohibition of intentional fallacies. This prohibition prohibits the deliberate use of fallacious arguments with misleading or otherwise morally reprehensible intent. Such a further reprehensible purpose is, for example, discrediting an argumentation partner through an ad hominem attack. Argumentation tact. Tact is a form of behavior that, out of respect, spares others from damaging attacks and damaging criticism. Argumentative discussion can cause such damage in two ways in particular. Justified argumentative criticism of the foundations of one's convictions causes the addressee of this criticism to be permanently and severely shaken emotionally or alienated from his social environment without any possibility of support. Or such criticism in front of others deprives him inappropriately of his self-esteem and the recognition by others. Avoiding such damage is an imperative of non-maleficence. Conversation norms. No duty to discuss. Sometimes it is assumed or insinuated that there is a duty to resolve disagreements discursively. However, I don't know of anyone who asserts and defends a respective general duty. There is far too much to be said against it. Time expenditure, other important matters, futility in many situations, and so on. A morally good duty to discuss would have to be quite specific. No exclusion of admissible discussion partners or verbal contributions. Who is admitted to a particular discussion as a discussion partner and on which topic they are allowed to speak depends on the official or unofficial purpose of the discussion group, the special rules for an associated panel, the agreement between partners, and so on. These are not questions that argumentation ethics would have to clarify. However, the ethics of argumentation prohibits the exclusion by unfair means, especially argumentative means, of participants in a discussion who have been admitted in principle, or preventing them from making contributions relevant to the topic. Civilized conversation. Also for dialogues, there are relevant norms of civilized behavior, that is, of civilized conversation, which go beyond the norms of interaction. These include the willingness to listen carefully to others, up to a certain point, openness to criticism of one's point and of one's biases, willingness to admit one's own mistakes and biases. Then we have interpretative charity. A specialization of the limited duty to listen attentively is interpretive charity, in particular the duty to interpret argument charitably. Charity means make the reconstruction of the other's argument as strong as possible, that is, so that an argumentatively valid and adequate argument for a thesis, substantial in the respective context, is created, but without violating the other principles of interpretation. The two most important limiting principles are authenticity, that is, the reconstruction has still to be a reconstruction of the argument of the original author. Therefore, impute only such implicit reasons, types of inferences, argument schemes, and steps to the author which the author accepts. And immanence, no overinterpretation. The reconstruction has still to be a reconstruction of the original argument. There are various reasons for interpretive charity. The most important moral reason for it is respect for the other person. One takes them seriously as a person and with their moral reason for, with their own opinion, and gives weight to what they really mean, while also getting beyond what they express and perhaps cannot express better. Let people finish. As a rule, it is unethical to deliberately block the communication process, for instance, to interrupt people before they have made their point, got their central message across, or to change the subject when the other person has more to say, or to distract others from the intended subject of the communication. Conversation economy and resource allocation. Talking far too long and redundantly, repeating arguments that have already been made, arguing in favor of something that has already been accepted or rejected in a panel, repeatedly bringing up new topics, especially simply by association, are ways of overusing scarce social resources and are therefore usually morally bad. A suitable standard of conversational economy: be brief, don't talk redundantly, speak on the topic, has only become established in relatively few contexts. Accordingly, a moral norm of conversational economy is so far socially valid only in these contexts. Taking seriously and answering. It is at least a matter of politeness, but even more a matter of respect to take seriously and answer the serious and relevant contributions of a discussion partner. To ignore or disregard them is a form of disrespect that is admonished by those who are somewhat more sensitive to moral issues. In this respect, here is a weak social norm that is also morally good. Duty to object. In applying to general duty to provide assistance, it may be a duty to object to false allegations. So I come to my fifth part, institutions. The institution of specific temporary cooperation. There are many forms of specific temporary cooperation in which agents come together voluntarily in order to achieve their own respective advantages. For one thing, in doing so, the cooperation can be subject to specific rules of cooperation with a certain function. The rules of a parlor game, rules of a restaurant visit, and so on. For another, such temporary cooperations are applications of the social institution of temporary cooperation, to which general moral norms apply, including the following. First, Rule C1, start. Enter into a cooperation with interested parties with a specific function by means of a free agreement if and only if this is advantageous for you and presumably for the cooperation partners. Norm 2, progression. During the cooperation, stick to the specific rules of this type of cooperation so that you both have the desired advantage. Rule 3, end. The cooperation ends when the cooperation objective has been achieved. However, unless otherwise agreed, you can withdraw from the cooperation. Second, if the other party, despite a reminder, does not sufficiently adhere to the specific or general cooperation rules, efficiency rules, or norms of civil behavior. Or third, if further participation in the cooperation is no longer useful or efficient for you, and unless you still have outstanding cooperation debts, such that the other party has provided a cooperation service while you still have to provide your corresponding service. If the cooperation partner does not adhere sufficiently to the specific cooperation rules, efficiency rules are rules of civil behavior. Breaking off the cooperation is initially a form of self-protection, but can also have an effect similar to sanction, especially if cooperation with this partner is reduced in future, and the bad communication experiences with this partner are also communicated to third parties. The start norm C1 implicitly presupposes that there is no permanent obligation to cooperate, contrary to what some careless formulation of communication ethics or discussion rules claim. A permanent obligation to cooperate would be an excessive demand. Elsewhere, I also discuss Grice's conversation maxims. The upshot is they are rules for an efficient conversation, but not moral norms. Argumentative discussions can be a form of temporary cooperation for mutual benefit. Not only do the moral norms of temporary cooperation apply to them, it is also rational and mutually advantageous if Grice's maxims of conversation are observed in them. We all know that they are often not observed. However, so far, their observance is not a moral obligation if they have not been agreed upon. The function of argumentative discussions has been interpreted in different ways, and the disputations developed within epistemological argumentation theory, the aim is, as I've said, to clarify the truth of a thesis cooperatively and argumentatively, and to establish any related true thesis. To achieve this goal, very precise rules have been developed. Apart from disputations, there are various other types of argumentative discussions with often not clearly defined goals and rules. No such system of rules is yet morally normatively binding, according to the general criterion. According to the moral norms for temporary cooperation, however, compliance becomes morally binding through an agreement on the use of a certain system of rules. But these systems of rules are instruments of varying quality, sometimes for different purposes. It is then a question of rationality, which purpose one pursues and which instruments one uses for it. The epistemic advantages of disputations are of paramount importance here. I come to the seventh part, norm support, more political commitment, and supererogation. Norm support, more political commitment, and supererogation are forms of moral behavior that are not obligatory in the strong sense, that is, made binding by the threat of sanctions, and are therefore motivationally based primarily on moral motives in the broad sense, such as empathy and moral self-image, but can also be supported by other motives that are not necessarily linked to moral content, such as the search for recognition or the exercise of power. Though these kinds of action are not morally duties, and hence go beyond deontology, they are enormously important for the general system of morals. Actions for supporting norms include promoting the social validity of the norm, admonitions to comply with the norm, preventing a violation of the norm, criticizing and other ways of punishing violators of the norm. In the field of argumentation and argumentative discussion, pertinent actions in support of the norm are, for example, demands to comply with certain norms, to obey prohibitions, for instance, demands to let others finish speaking, not to become polemical, to remain factual, to get to the point, or to criticize, especially publicly when these norms have been violated, to explain to others the meaning and importance of the rules of argumentation and the associated moral norms. Moral norms are motivationally very much based on this pressure on potential norm violators, generated by norm support. Actions to support the norms relevant to argumentation are correspondingly important, especially in times when there is a threat of a decline of these norms and the culture of argumentation and discussion. More political commitment for better moral norms. Such a moral political commitment consists of actions aimed at improving the stock of existing moral norms. These are in particular actions that promote such new norms, which set a good example. Commitment in institutions to enforce a new, better norm. The institution may, for example, decide to adopt certain rules of discussion. Criticism of people who do not yet follow this norm. More political commitment should be morally efficient, that is, aim at the best possible among the realizable new norms. What norms are these today? First, perhaps in the current situation, the most efficient such commitment is the defensive struggle against a decline in moral norms for argumentation, because the corresponding standards are still observed in many areas and are therefore still or already known in areas where they are frequently or regularly violated. For example, civility in dealings between political opponents, especially with a self-commitment to valid arguments in critical debate with them. Second, so far, adherence to certain argumentation standards is technical, not a moral question. How good was the argument? In the medium and long term, however, an attempt could be made to make epistemically good argumentation more widely known and also to disseminate it in practical application and make it normatively binding. Supererogatory acts are morally good actions that go beyond moral duty. Sometimes the willingness to engage in discussion with others when one does not expect any epistemic advantage for oneself from this discussion, but primarily intends to impart knowledge to the discussion partner, is supererogatory. Such conditions may especially hold in cases of, for instance, professional conditioned epistemic superiority over this discussion partner. The implementation of Oliveira de Sousa's ideal of virtuous argumentation, namely the ideal that through the actions of the arguer, the discussion partner becomes a better arguer, is also a supererogatory act with argumentation pedagogical content. Oliveira de Sousa also mentions a number of roles in which this argumentation pedagogical goal is realized: teacher, supervisor of a thesis, therapist, commentator. However, the bearers of these roles are usually paid for their argumentation pedagogical work and therefore only act in a supererogatory manner if they are particularly committed to their actions. This shows that the argumentation pedagogical ideal propagated by Oliveira de Sousa is very demanding. It is also so demanding that we cannot rely on supererogatory commitment for the extent of argumentation pedagogy necessary for the satisfactory cultivation of the morally important social argumentation culture, but also and primarily need institutions and organizations in which professional argumentation teachers and trainers perform these tasks in return for payment. Corresponding institutions and organizations are therefore further extremely important means of realizing morally good argumentation practice. Moral argumentation virtues. In welfare ethics, virtues and virtuous persons are not, as in virtue ethics, independent sources of moral content, but rather they are special good instruments which improve the world morally in an effective and efficient way, or persons respectively who have realized these instruments or who implement certain moral conduct, where however this content has been determined independently, namely with the help of the moral evaluation criteria developed in the moral value theory. Virtuous people have internalized morally good behavior in the form of fixed attitudes, which are firmly anchored in them. Some advantages of this internalization are that virtuous people are no longer have to decide so much in the individual cases, that their preformed decisions already have a morally good content, and that they also have a reasonably reliable motivation to act in a morally good way. Going into more details, we can distinguish between three types of moral virtue content. First, there are well internalized duties and rules. Second, morally proactive action. And third, particularly extensive supererogation. Applied to argumentations and argumentative discussions, these types of moral virtue are evident, among others, in the following types of action. First, well-internalized duties. The duty internalizer very eagerly heeds the moral components of the argumentation norms. She provides good arguments, pays attention to objectivity, is modest about the duration of contributions, openly admits when she's wrong, is particularly open to criticism by scrutinizing it especially carefully, above all when it is new to her, etc. But she is also committed to imperfect duty, in particular to enforcing norms. She gently but firmly points out violations of norms to others. Second, morally proactive action. The morally proactive agent is, for instance, committed more politically to the moral improvement of argumentation and to the introduction of new standards and the discourse for rising epistemically standards. And the third group, extensive supererogation. Supererogatorily particularly committed people can engage in argumentation pedagogy. The crucial difference with a virtue ethical approach is that what is virtuous is determined according to independent welfare ethical criteria by which it can be shown that the virtuous actions are morally good, that is, in the end, raise the moral beneficiaries' utilities. So, last part, outlook and conclusion. The instruments considered so far are probably the most common and frequently used instruments of morals. According to the program of instrument welfarism, argumentation morals should examine and develop further instruments. That is, expand the range of available instruments, for instance, to include moral norms for special institutional argumentation, e.g., parliamentary debates or judicial justifications, rules of argumentation ethics without normatively binding character, education in argumentation ethics, measures against discrimination of certain groups in discourse, support programs for those who are weak at arguing as a remedy for their social disadvantage, and so on. Researching and developing these instruments is a task for the future. In conclusion, I would like to briefly summarize. The aim of this talk was to outline a systematic approach to argumentation ethics. This systematic approach was based on general welfare ethics as its theoretical foundation, but went beyond conventional welfare ethics in the field of praxeology through progressive norm welfarism as a conception of moral duties and instrument welfarism as a general moral praxeology. An intermezzo on argumentation theory that clarified the utility of argumentation with the help of epistemological argumentation theory. Progressive norm welfarism binds moral duties to socially valid, morally good norms. For this reason, socially valid, morally good norms that can be applied to arguments were compiled in the application section. In addition, several other instruments for the moral improvement argumentation were examined. The instruments of temporary cooperation, norm support, moral political commitment, supererogation, and argumentation ethical virtues. Altogether, I think to have shown that welfare ethics, and in particular instrumental welfarism, is a fruitful systematic approach to argumentation ethics. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much.